This is Sheila Butler with Successful Women Talk, and I am excited today to have a special guest. And as you're going to be able to see, he's not a woman, but he's full of knowledge. We are happy to have Srinivas Rao. He is the host and co-founder of Blogcast FM. He also has a personal blog at theschooloflife.com. He's a blogger, social media enthusiast. He's a podcaster, digital storyteller. He is a rock star in the media world. So welcome, Srini.
Thanks so much for having me, Sheila.
Well, thank you for joining us. So I'm going to kind of start off like you do in your podcast, which is tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got started in this business.
So, as some of you who may have heard of me or may not have heard of me, if you've heard of me, you kind of know this story. But I graduated from business school in April 2009, and I got out of school, and the job market was just horrendous. It was a really, really bad time to get out of school. And I realized that sending out resumes was not going to work, and I needed a way to stand out in the job market, especially if I wanted a job working in social media, because my interest in social media had kind of been peaked the summer before, where I did an internship at Intuit in their TurboTax group. I was a social media strategy intern. But what I found was that what I loved most was creating content and playing with things and experimenting with things. So I was always dabbling in content creation. I had about 5 or 6 different blogs that I attempted before all this. But when I got to the end of school, I realized I was going to have to get pretty serious about this, and I needed a way to stand out in the job market. So I enrolled in this thing called Blog Mastermind by this guy named Yaro Starik, and I started my blog, The School of Life. And where the whole idea for The School of Life came from is I was watching this movie, coincidentally called The School of Life, about 2 weeks before I graduated, with Ryan Reynolds. And it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's an independent film. And it was just this very interesting take on school. And I thought, wow, okay, this is such a great name for a blog. Well, the name School of Life was taken, spelled correctly. So I decided to spell it SKOOL. And the message of the blog really kind of has evolved over time. I got out of school and I'd realized, wow, I've been working for 10 years. I got an undergraduate degree, and now I have an MBA, and I am completely unprepared and lost and don't feel like I'm ready for this. And what am I doing right back where I started when I graduated from high school? This is ridiculous. I can't believe I spent all this money, got all these degrees and all this experience, and I'm right back where I started. So I had this sense that there had to be things wrong with the sort of formula of conventional wisdom: go to school, get a job, go to another school, get a better job, because it didn't work for me. So what ended up happening is the theme of my blog ended up becoming what you should have learned in school but never did. And so as a byproduct of the School of Life, where I was blogging, one of the things that I was told to do as part of this Blog Mastermind course was to start interviewing people. And so I started a weekly series on my blog called Interviews with Up-and-Coming Bloggers, and every week I would interview somebody, and about 13 or 14 interviews later, one of the guys I interviewed, a guy named Sid Savara, who was my former business partner, came back to me and he said, you know what, he's like, I think you should take this and spin it out as a separate site. And he's like, your writing kind of sucks anyways, so I think you should do interviews. And so I realized that it was actually a pretty good idea. And so what I did was I replied back to him. I said, that sounds great. When do you want to get started? And I think about 24 hours later, I bought the domain Blogcast FM. I thought, okay, that sounds like an interesting enough name. And basically we looked and saw the domain was available. So I bought it right away, and I started laying out and mocking up the site. And I knew that the fact that I took action on it so quickly meant that there must be something there, and it was important to me. And so that's how I got started. Pretty much. That's a short version of a very long story.
That's a terrific story. I love, because I listen to your podcast as well, which I love your podcast, and we'll get into that. But one thing that I've heard you say before that always kind of strikes a chord with me is I also have an MBA. And my MBA helped me in the point that I was in a very niche healthcare market, and it opened my eyes to something totally different that I probably would not have seen. But I think a lot of people think you have to have an MBA to succeed in business, and I'm like you, I don't think you do at all.
Oh, I think it almost limits you because it gives you a lot of preconceived notions of what's right. Because what does an MBA do? It gives you a filter and a lens through which you view the world. And part of what I think enables people to be successful is to develop context and develop filters. And the problem is sometimes our filters actually get in the way. And, I think, who was it? I think it was the guy from 37 Signals gave this great speech at the Stanford Entrepreneurial Thought Leaders series where he says, unlearn your MBA. And I've kind of have mixed feelings about an MBA because I was like, does this prepare you to actually run a business and teach you about business, or does it prepare you to go be a worker in somebody else's business? And I think it's the latter.
That's a great point. And it's kind of that whole thing with the E-Myth thing. Are you working in your business or on your business? And the nice thing again for me, it was a networking thing, but even that, I think everything in life happens for a reason. So I went to get my MBA for a reason, and I started a business with a business partner for a reason, and all of those things change. But networking, what I've learned in the last 2 years, those networks that I've even built online are somewhat stronger than the ones that I developed in my MBA program.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's one of the beautiful things about the world we live in today is that social media gives you access to people you might have never otherwise have access to. And they're really, really interesting, amazing, creative, and brilliant people. And so, the connections I've made through blogging, social media, through podcasting have been far more valuable than anybody I met in my MBA. I mean, I have some great friends from business school, don't get me wrong, but from a career perspective, in terms of basically helping me and giving me an opportunity to learn from them, the people I've met online have been just amazing.
I agree. Same thing here. So let's hop back just a little bit. So you started this business, Broadcast FM, with a business partner, Sid. He's no longer involved. Is that correct?
That's correct. And, Sid is absolutely fabulous. I mean, I always have to give him credit for having the idea for Broadcast FM. I mean, he had the foresight to see that there was a lot more here than just doing a weekly blog post on my blog. But we got into a point, I think sometime last year, where we realized that one, we were, it's interesting because our partnership really was built on disagreement. We disagreed on almost everything. And it was a fabulous formula for success because he was a great devil's advocate because I'm forever optimistic. In fact, he has a great post on his blog titled Just Stubborn Enough, which is all about me and the way I am, because he would come to me, I would come to him with an idea, he would say it's not going to work, and I would say, okay, well, you know what, I'm going to go do it anyways, and it would work. But the thing is, it was great because it provided this nice balance. Well, eventually it got to the point where we were starting to really just disagree on everything, and we stopped trying things. We stopped taking action. And the other thing is, I think we both had different long-term visions for what we thought it would be. And I think the final factor for him is that really the show was built around me because I was the host and he was really sort of doing just the operational things. And so when you looked at kind of the time that he was putting in versus the reward that he was getting out of it, you can't, it kind of made sense for us to part ways. And it's funny because he one of the things I have to credit Sid for is he's got amazing foresight to see decisions that I should make. And we'll talk about how my new business partner, David, came into the fold. But the very first time I did anything with David, it was a product called How to Grow Your Blog with Interviews. And when I told Sid about the success of it, he said, you should fire me and you should make David your business partner.
So let's talk about that. So if Sid's no longer, is David now, David Crandall, works with you guys, is he a full partner in your business?
Yeah, he is.
That's terrific. And you can see the change because right about the time I started listening to you all, your website changed, your look and feel changed. I think a lot of that is based on David's design. So let's talk about the impact that he's had starting with you in your business.
Well, so we probably want to go as far back as how we met and how we connected. And
sure.
This is actually a really funny story because I wrote a guest post for another blog called Think Traffic, and the post was about how to grow your blog with interviews. And so David saw the post, and he was one of the few people who said, hey, this is great advice. I'm going to start a podcast. So being the humble person I am, I emailed him right away. I said, well, hey, if you're starting a podcast and you're interviewing people, can I be the first guest? And so I ended up being the first guest on his podcast. He did it for a while. It was really great for him. And so one day I emailed him. I said, hey, you've done about 9 of these. I said, you know what? I've been listening to this interview with this guy named Dave Navarro that I did, and he has this advice on how to create a product in an hour. I said, do you want to do one together? Because I think you're one of the few people that I could accomplish this with. And so we did a product called How to Grow Your Blog with Interviews. It was just an hour-long teleclass. And, the seeds of David's design skills were right there. And I think the funny thing is he kind of overlooked that aspect of what he was good at for a very long time because he was kind of a standard sort of personal development, feel-good blogger with this blog called Heroic Destiny. And so he designed the worksheets for it. We did the product, and it sold. I mean, it was something that it took us an hour to make, and it still sells to this day. I mean, we just got sales the other day, and we do no promotion of it whatsoever. And when that happened, Sid basically said, look, he's like, you guys are generating sales off this. And he's like, you should fire me and make David your business partner. And I was like, well, we're not going to do that. But David and I started talking about that whole idea of him coming on board on Blogcast FM for a long time. So I think he was just a natural successor, and it didn't hurt that he had listened to every episode of the show. In fact, he was probably more familiar with it than I was. I never used to listen to the interviews myself because I have severe ADD and they're really long for me. But I've been much better about that now. And the main reason I listen to them now is so that I can keep refining my skill set as an interviewer. But what was interesting with David coming on board is that we had this sort of unique intersection of right brain thinking and left brain thinking, because he's very analytical, but he also has this amazing design ability. David's genius is that he knows how to alter brand perception through design, and I think he can do it for anybody. And so I think that the funny thing is that he overlooked that for a long time, as many of us tend to do. We go through the blogosphere and we overlook the very thing that we know how to do. We take it for granted. I mean, he's got 18 years of professional graphic design experience. So you combine that with the fact that we wanted to start thinking of ourselves as a media company, and he's had just a profound impact on how people view what Blogcast FM is, how people kind of view us in the world. And of course, we both sat down. We said, in December of January of 2011, we said, look, let's start getting to know our listeners better. And we can talk about this in a bit more detail. I mean, it's kind of how you and I connected. I got to the point where I said, you know what, I want to start having more conversations with people one-on-one so we can start understanding the user experience, because David's design was all driven by a lot of what we heard, and a lot of the decisions we've made have been driven by what we've heard. And it's amazing because a lot of it didn't come through, surveys and market research. It came through one-on-one conversations by saying, hey, I know you've been listening to our show for a long time. Do you mind if we chat? I really would love your feedback because we want to really step our game up. And I think that, if you look at what we've done in the last probably 6 to 8 months, it's been not 6 to 8 months, but if you look at what we've done in the last 6 months, we're not the same show we were even in November of last year.
And you know what's exciting about that, Srini, is that it was a good show before, and it's a great show now. And I agree. Your interviews, and we're going to talk about some of those in just a few minutes, are terrific, and they're applicable. But one thing I want to step back to that you mentioned earlier was you were talking about David didn't realize his skill sets. And I think as individuals, women are really tend to do this sometimes. We don't toot our own horn, and we don't realize that what we take for granted might be super nuggets for somebody else, and we forget about those things.
Well, it's funny because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about you. I remember the first time you sat down and you chatted with me and you told me about your background, and I was like, wait a minute. I was like, I think you realize you may not realize you may be new to the online world, but you've got an insane entrepreneurial background that is going to be invaluable in being able to do what you want to do here. I mean, when you told me about your furniture business, I thought, wow, I was like, I have a lot to learn from somebody like you.
Well, thank you. And, I think you helped me realize that, and the interview that you did yesterday with Mars Dorian helped me realize that as well. If you got to find that, you have information. And what I took for granted in building a multi-7-figure business from an operations and logistics standpoint, I take it for granted. But, I talk to people and I do consulting, and they're like, how do you think that way? And to me, it's like, it's just eye-opening. So I love that you shared that about David, and it helped me realize that about myself as well. So I'm sorry.
Oh, so, it's funny. I'm working on a new concept, which I don't know if I've talked to you about it yet, but it's something that's kind of in an incubation period based on exactly this issue called the digital expression session. And the whole idea of it is to flip this whole interview process on its head, reverse engineer it, and turn it into a consulting session where we sit down, I do an interview with somebody, have them share their story, because even in sharing your own story with somebody, what you'll find is all these nuggets that you didn't realize that were there. And so the whole idea behind that is basically to help people sort of, become aware of their blind spots.
I love that. And another thing that you said that I really like is that you just reached out to David. You reached out to Sid. You keep reaching out. It's just like a lot of us don't do that because of fear. And it seems like you're doing that. And such a great example for those of us out there that are a little bit fearful to try. Just ask. So how do you get the courage to just go, hey, let's do this?
Well, it's funny because my friend Bernardo Mendez asked me about relationships and how I've built so many. I mean, I have a natural affinity for people. I like people. I like connecting with people. I'm very extroverted, as you may have gathered. Uh, but what I've found generally is that flattery will get you everywhere. It's a really interesting thing. But Jeff Hayden is this guy who writes a lot of really amazing articles for Inc. And he had this great article just a few days ago about the 10 qualities of the most charismatic people in the world. And one of them was that they make a point to compliment other people's work. And I am constantly on the lookout for, it has to be done in an authentic way. That's
Sure.
one I want to caution people about sort of approaching it that way. But nobody will ever get upset with you for complimenting them on their work. I mean, those emails, when people email me and say, hey, I just want to let you know your show has made a difference, or reading your blog has done these amazing things for my life. Those emails just make my day. I mean, they just put a smile on my face. And I think that what I would say is, if you want to conquer the fear, don't think about what can I get from this person. Think about it from the perspective of, what can I do to put a smile on this person's face? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, what's there to fear about putting a smile on somebody's face? Nothing wrong with that. And I found that people are very approachable when you come from that angle, because that's what I think we all long for that to some degree. I mean, no matter how much somebody compliments you, somebody basically flattering your ego is never going to get old. And the key, I think, is for anybody not to let it get to your head when it happens to you. But it's amazing. I mean, when I was at Blog World, I had a lot of people come up to me and say, "Hey, I listened to your show," and it's kind of like, "Really?" It's like, "Yeah, you get to work every day." I was like, "That's so weird." I mean, it's just cool, it's flattering. And so in that sense, I think that's really the approach you take to reaching out, and don't stop doing it. Here's the other thing is that I realized the other day that I hadn't looked at who was following me on Twitter in a really long time. And I don't look at the numbers. I could care less how many people are following me. I'm much more interested in who's following me. But I looked and I was like, wow, there's all these really interesting people there. And so I just started kind of reaching out and saying, hey, how did you find me? And I think the other part of it is taking a genuine interest in other people's stories.
I agree. I think because I think we can learn from other people's stories, even if they're not in your industry. You have different backgrounds. I think we can glean so much information from that, which is terrific. So let's talk about this. So you decided to start a blog, and I think you look at your blog as a business, where I think some people look at their blogs as a blog, and if it turns into a business, that's something different. But I think you have a kind of an interesting perspective about this. Can you share that with us on your opinion on business versus just blogging?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you say that, because I probably fell into the first camp for a very long time. I didn't really see it as a business. I thought, okay, well, I have this blog and there's all these ways to monetize a blog, so I'm going to try and monetize, right? And I realized that this goes back again to that whole sort of concept of context, and how context sort of defines all the actions that you take. Well, if the context is, I'm a blogger and I'm going to try to make money blogging, it's kind of weird. It's like, okay, well, that sounds all nice. And you talk to almost anybody, like, very few people actually make money blogging. I mean, I'm not, if you happen to have a site that gets millions of views every month, and, people buy ads on it, sure, you might make money technically just doing nothing but blogging. But I don't think that's the case with almost anybody. So changing that context for me really came in the last couple of months more than anything else. I mean, early November, I had to start saying, okay, you know what? This whole approach of we're a podcast is just wrong. It doesn't work. And so the context changed to, okay, we're a media company. So let's not ask ourselves what the most successful bloggers would do. Let's ask ourselves what the most successful media companies in the world, or magazine and publishing companies in the world would do, and how would they behave. And when we started modeling ourselves and looking at people like NBC, so like, what does NBC do? If NBC had 200 episodes of Friends, guess what? They don't basically produce new ones until they're blue in the face. Yeah, they did 10 seasons. Guess what? NBC still makes money off of 10 seasons of Friends, because they syndicated to other outlets. They sold advertising against their syndication. They did box sets. They did DVDs. And so what do companies that are media companies do? They look at what they already have as assets, and they think about how those assets can be used to generate revenue. So that really, it was kind of a major shift in perspective for me, and having David sort of see things that I didn't see was also nice, because there are obviously things that you're blind to when you're doing stuff on your own.
That's terrific. And so now I know you don't like to compare yourself to other. I've heard that in your podcast. But are you kind of taking yourself from, okay, I'm not, Blogcast FM is not against another blog right now. We're really going to set our standards higher. And have you seen a change in your business? Have you seen a growth in your business since you made the change?
Yeah, I think there's two things that have happened. One is the perception of what we do has changed quite dramatically. I mean, you kind of look at the iTunes reviews, and I've been asking for iTunes reviews, as anybody who listens to the show knows, but I'm not telling people what to write.
Sure.
I think that there are two things that have come from that. I mean, one is that we kind of said, okay, you know what, we want to become a hub for small business, and what does that mean in terms of the interviews? Well, the interviews have to be actionable, which, you know, as we were talking about before we hit record, the three most commonly used adjectives to describe what we do are actionable, insightful, and useful. And I thought, well, that should be in our branding and our messaging. So yeah, I would say it's had a profound impact. And even in terms of sort of painting a picture of what we want this to look like a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, it's changed. And also in terms of who we interview. I mean, I think the show, when I first started it, was truly about just blogging. And what has happened now is it's become a show about online business and how to run a business. And I think that that's because of my own interests and my own sort of evolution into an entrepreneur, and from being just a content creator into an entrepreneur.
Terrific. So let's talk about, how do you, when you start, let's look at you a couple of years ago when you no one really maybe didn't know, you weren't as popular, they didn't know about you. How did you get guests? It's probably a little bit easier for you to get guests today, I'm guessing, based on your experience and the value that you put in the market. But how did you go about getting guests in the beginning?
Well, you know, so remember, as I had mentioned to you, I mean, the initial series that we started with was called Interviews with Up and Coming Bloggers. And so it was pretty much all people who are at my same level. I was just interested in their stories. So when we launched Blogcast FM, we came out of the gate with about 13 or 14 interviews. Now, having Sid as a business partner actually ended up being incredibly valuable because he was pretty well known. I mean, he had a fairly substantial blog. He had a guest post on places like Zen Habits. And he kind of introduced me to a lot of people, which helped tremendously. But I think that it got to the point where eventually I was able to start reaching out on my own because we had sort of just kept building based on interview. You know, every time we did a new interview, I would ask people for referrals. I'd say, hey, is there anybody else you think I should interview? And I've been making a point to do that recently. I mean, when I had Danielle Laporte on my show, I asked her for some recommendations, and she gave me some amazing recommendations, Diana Valentine being the one that comes to mind. Lately, every time I see a tweet, somebody mentions, hey, Diana, I just heard your interview on Blogcast FM, and I'm kind of like, yes, that's what I'd like.
Yay!
Funny because I was tweeting with her last night. I said, I think it's going to be a contest between you and Mai for who's the most popular female guest on the show. And she said, well, you know, and then we jokingly said, you know, it's like, maybe we should just do an episode with both of you on the show, which actually happened. But, you know, so a lot of it came down to asking. I'm constantly on the lookout too. I look for people who are interesting, and sometimes there'll be people who are just new, but, what happened over time is, you know, obviously you said now you've got this credibility because I've got a lot of people that I can cite as, hey, we've had this person, we've had that person. But in the early days, it was starting with people who are at the same level, because one of the things that I have found is that people are always looking for publicity and exposure. And Richard Branson talks about this in his books. He says you should never turn down an opportunity to be interviewed. And that's why I never do. No matter who it is. And so that's kind of the approach I took in the beginning. And as we've evolved, it's just kind of grown from there. And a lot of it has with each person you say, okay, who should I interview? I mean, there's a guy named Josh Hannigarty who was the very first interview I ever did. And so I asked him, and he referred me to a girl named Kelly Deals. Well, she gave me a list of 5 people I should interview. And bit by bit, it kind of just kept growing from there. So eventually I had this list. And the nice thing is, because they knew those people, you could always refer them and say, hey, I was referred to you by so-and-so. Would you be interested?
I think that's terrific insight, because it's okay to ask. And every once in a while, you may get turned down. But I have found the same thing. I've just asked in an honest, authentic way, and people have been very kind about, sure, you know, they love the thought of getting to talk about themselves a bit, getting exposure, and then also seeing what you're doing as well. So I think that's terrific advice. So I've noticed lately, because I am, like I said, a big fan of your podcast as well. Your interviews are changing a bit. We just talked about that. Maybe not changing. You're a great interviewer, first of all. But like I will tell you, the last two interviews that I listened to, Mars Dorian and Linda Rubrat, wow. She talked about SEO basics. I went straight to her website, straight and subscribed to her Twitter account. I mean, really terrific, insightful information that you can apply immediately. I love that.
Well, it kind of goes back to that whole thing we were talking about. When we look at our branding and our messaging and what people say is that, the interviews are actionable, insightful, and useful. And my whole thing with any interview is that every interview has to have at least one actionable insight, something that people can say, you know what, I can use that right away. And I aim for that in every interview. And it's funny because there are interviews where I'm listening to the guest and thinking, I'm like, damn it, you better get to that point because I'm getting a little them, because they're telling their story. I mean, that's really the onus is on me to ask the right question that gets that out of them. But it's funny because I know that that's where I want to go. And there's some interesting things about how I do interviews that some people may or may not know about. One is that there's no scripts. I never have any idea what I'm going to ask anybody. I know about their background. I know my starting points and I know my ending points. And what I always tell people is you kind of think of it as as traveling without a guidebook, because you know what, when you travel without a guidebook, you get to end up off the beaten path, and off the beaten path is where the really cool things are. No, none of the interesting things are the standard tourist attractions that you find in a Lonely Planet guide. It's when you're willing to kind of just ditch the guide and go, you get the really juicy stuff. And that's kind of the way I treat interviews. So I'll usually build questions based on people's answers, but in the back of my head, I'm always thinking about that whole concept of, okay, I want this to be actionable. I want to be able to have people walk away from this and say, you know what, I can use exactly what I've learned. And, we just had an interview recently with a guy named Ben Settle about email marketing, one of my absolute favorite interviews on email marketing, and a really cool guy. And I learned so much. And here's another fundamental shift that has also evolved over time. This happened early on for me. I realized that there was a point in which I used to think, okay, if I interview famous people, they'll share my interviews and all the interviews will go viral. Well, that's just stupid. Yeah, sure, they share interviews, but that doesn't mean the interviews go viral because not everybody listens to podcasts. And what I realized was that the show had to be about listeners, and it had to be all about the listener and not about me or about the guest, but what kind of, how can you make this the most valuable hour that somebody spends? And it's funny. Another woman I interviewed kind of said a similar thing. She said, I listened to your show for a long time at the beginning, and she said, there were nuggets of wisdom here and there, but lately it's one of those things where you kind of have to just keep your ears glued and your pen, on a piece of paper because you have so many notes that you want to take by the end of it. And that really is flattering to hear. So, it's funny. I was joking with Bernardo. I said, yeah, some people say, okay, well, you're a natural at interviews. I said, yeah, 250 plus interviews later, I've figured out how to be a natural at it. But I think what it stems from is this sort of overwhelming desire to, one, make everything actionable. And I've been doing a lot of digging on sort of deeper things, like what is the purpose of what I do and why do I do what I do? And, the sort of mission and purpose behind what we do came down to one thing for me. It was kind of like this idea that what we're in the world to do is to educate aspiring entrepreneurs with expert business advice through interviews. And I thought, well, that's that is the first time I've heard myself put it that way, but that made a lot of sense to me. And so that's really what has driven a lot of how we've evolved.
And with that evolution, you guys also have started now on your site a blog. So I was reading or listening to something the other day, and they were like, you have to have all forms of media, or you should, whether that be video, audio, and some people don't read, but some people do. Is that why you guys ended up adding the blog, so you would have a different aspect of the look at things?
Yeah, so that was definitely one of the drivers behind it. We realized that it was kind of funny that we had a podcast about blogging, but we didn't have a blog of our a lot of people that actually was driven again by listener feedback. This, one of the things we realized was that people didn't come to our website. It was challenging to not have people come to your website because it was a podcast, right? Most people listen via iTunes, and we're like, how do you get more people here? And so we asked, like, what would get you to come to the site? And people actually had said, well, we are actually interested in hearing your insights as somebody who interviews people. We'd be very curious to hear what your synthesis is in a written format. And, I mean, I've done some contributing myself to the blog, but we're really treating it as a community thing. We want to showcase the work of our listeners. We want to showcase the work of our guests. And that was definitely a big part of it. And obviously, from an SEO perspective, it makes a big difference. So David has been really kind of the leading force behind the blog. I mean, he's really the editor-in-chief of the blog. I contribute occasionally to it, but I guess if you kind of separated out our responsibilities, I'm sort of the head of all multimedia content development, and he heads all written content.
It's a nice division. And it's nice your strengths, you said, are not writing, but it is interviewing, and his is probably the opposite, I'm guessing. So it works nicely together. So what about, how do you, when someone says, okay, so I've developed this blog, I'm kind of getting readers to come to my site, but it's difficult to get them to come to your site. What about, you hear the importance of the list, having an email list. What's your opinion on that, and what advice would you give to someone?
Well, it's funny. I'm guilty of, as anybody, of not maintaining it or starting it as early as I should have. It was one of the most tragic mistakes I made in building Blogcast FM and the School of Life, is that I never paid attention to the email list. And I realized that it is sort of this foundational piece of your business, because it allows you to share things with people. Like with RSS, with Twitter, you're kind of dependent on putting something out there and hoping people come. Whereas you kind of have more control when it comes to your email list, and you have a different relationship with that list. So I think it is a foundational element of any online business. I mean, there's not a single person who I've interviewed who hasn't said that where they make their money is from their list. And so I think it is an important thing. I think that maintaining a relationship with that list is really key. You kind of have to, you can't treat it as this asset that's part of your business that is just like a physical asset. You have to remember that it's made up of people, and there are real people on the receiving end of your email. Sometimes I think we forget that just because you're online, it doesn't mean that people can't feel what you're thinking. It's a really strange thing to think that, but it's true. You send an email and you do have an impact on somebody's day. I mean, whether they read your email or not, that's and eventually, like, Mars was actually really great in that, he talked about how he uses his cartoons, and people look forward to his emails because he's got a very authentic way of speaking to them. And so I think that it comes down to being genuine in what you do. I mean, like, I'll share an example. So I was writing yesterday's email newsletter, and as people who've been following me on Facebook and Twitter, I've been fighting off some sort of a flu or cold, and it won't go away, and it's driving me nuts. Well, I wrote about it in the newsletter. I said, hey, I'm fighting off this bug and it's winning, but I'm still jamming on all the other stuff we're doing. So it kind of is important that you're human, and people realize that, okay, you're not just this automated piece of software that goes out and puts out your stuff, but you are a real person, and that's what I have found has been effective. So yeah, I think that's I'm not probably the best person to ask about how to do it well. There are people who are a lot better at it, but it's become more and more important to me. And
I think your best point that you brought up about that is it's about relationships. So we shared before when we talked, my background in business has been offline, and I built a business based on great customer service, great design, and networking, and caring about people. And what I have found is that it is the exact same thing online. Some people don't get that, like you said, but it really is. It's networking and really building relationships with people.
Yeah, without it.
Yeah, I think it's truly important. So you've got the podcast, you have now the blog, and then you guys launched Look, the magazine. So let's talk about that.
So Look has been a really interesting project. I mean, that really has been more David's thing than mine, but just a super cool project. It's kind of going through some growing pains right now. I mean, we realized one is that it takes a hell of a lot of work to put it together.
Sure.
We're looking at different ways to do it. Probably what will end up happening is a more scaled down version of it. But again, it was another medium for us to do a couple of different things. I mean, one is to showcase David's design talent. You look at Look on the iPad, it's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it's something that stands out. And we wanted to look at another component of people's stories, and Look gave us a way to do that, which was, tell the human side of somebody's stories, tell the story behind who they are, not just, hey, this is how you grow your blog, this is how I've done what I've done, these are the actionable sides and tactical sides of what I do, but sort of a human interest piece, because we felt that if we did that, it would sort of bridge the gap between sort of the blogosphere and the mainstream world. So we would get people who may not necessarily ever become bloggers, who may not necessarily ever listen to our show, but would just find these stories interesting, become a part of it. And so it's one of those things that I think it's kind of, again, not on hold necessarily, but we're sort of thinking it through in terms of what its ultimate purpose is going to be. What David likes to say is it's a labor of love, and it really is. You look at the amount of work that went into it. The first few issues were just insane. And eventually I think it'll be a medium in which we have advertisers and other things. So what it finally looks like, I'm not sure, but I still am very excited about the possibilities for it. It's another component of our brand and what we call our media empire, because if you think about it, you look at a media company, right? What do? They have multiple forms of media. Like Oprah is a perfect example, right? She has her show, she has her online presence, she has her magazines, she has books. So you look at that and you're like, wait a minute, all forms of media are part of a media empire. And so Look kind of falls under that sort of umbrella. And I think as we grow and we have more resources, it'll become bigger.
I love that. So let's look at this. People look at you maybe and go, oh, he has a podcast. I know a lot of people are talking about podcasting right now. I know with the last Blog World and it's changing, New Media Expo. So podcasting is becoming a big thing. So let's talk equipment and technology. So when you started, did you know anything about podcasting, and what equipment do you use to make it all happen?
Well, it's funny because I'm probably the most ghetto equipment person. I still am. The headset that I'm using costs $50, and it took me a year to upgrade to it after getting enough emails from our listeners saying your podcast is great, but your audio quality sucks. I mean, I've been thinking about upgrading the equipment, but what I love about podcasting is that the barrier to entry is low, which has its pros and cons, right? I mean, the barrier to entry being low means the market gets flooded with a lot of crap too. There's a lot of lousy stuff on iTunes. Just because there's a lot of lousy stuff online in general, because the fact that there's so many people creating content and so much noise. So, but on the flip side of that, what's cool is you don't need a lot of money. I mean, this is a $50 headset. Most computers have a lot of free programs built in. Skype is free. I basically use Skype. There's a software called Skype Call Recorder that costs $20. And so literally it costs the cost of a website. And, if you really get smart about it, a designer and all of that is all it really takes. So I don't use anything particularly sophisticated. I used, I think, a GarageBand to edit. I like things to be simple. That's just the way I am. I don't like complicated stuff. Because I don't have the attention span for anything complicated. So I keep it as simple as possible. But there's a good chance that, when we get to the point where we have a lot more revenue coming in, I'll set up a proper studio and all of that stuff. And the other thing with having this is that it's portable. I can do this from anywhere. Whereas if you have like a full-blown podcasting studio and equipment and all this stuff, it makes it challenging to travel. And as anybody knows, I'm an avid surfer, so I don't like being tied to a location.
Sure. I had a feeling you were going to say that, which is why I wanted to bring it up, because I think it's an important point that people need to realize is that you don't have to have thousands of dollars worth of equipment. You can use the basics and still get by just starting. Mm-hmm. Just starting.
Well, at the end of the day, right? I mean, if you look at it, I used the built-in equipment on my MacBook for almost a year and a half, for probably well over 100 episodes, and people still listen to our show because the content was good. So that's something you want to think about, is that it's not necessarily, you could have a show that sounds amazing, but if the content sucks, who cares if the quality of the sound is fantastic?
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. I listen to nothing but podcasts and informational stuff. So what's loaded in your podcast? What's in your podcast list? What do you listen to?
Okay, so this is going to sound horrible, but I don't listen to podcasts. Because I don't have the attention span for them. But I will say there are certain podcasts that I will kind of dabble through every now and then, and the people whose podcasts I will listen all the way through that I love because they're quick enough and I can handle it with my attention span. Are the Lifestyle Business Podcast by the guys at the Tropical MBA. They do a fantastic job. I do like Bernardo's show, Bernardo Mendez from Your Great Life TV, mainly because he has such inspiring guests and he's so good on video that you can kind of just you can watch his stuff for hours because it's really good. So I do make a point to especially when he has really interesting guests, I always make a point to look at what they're up to and what they're saying. But in general, I don't listen to a ton of podcasts, as weird as that sounds.
I love that. I love the honesty. That's what's most important. That's what makes it authentic, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. If you had someone that asked you today, I'm just starting out in business, just starting out blogging, wanting to start a business, whether that be written or in audio format, what advice would you give that new person?
Well, I'll give them the advice that somebody asked me about this yesterday, and I always say sort of just take the first step. And the reason I always say take the first step is because when you take the first step, what happens is, and I've said this 1,000 times before on my show, it's like standing in two different spots in the same room. When you stand in a second spot, the view changes. So you'll see things that you didn't see before. And every time you keep taking a step forward, well, you start seeing other things that you didn't see before. Like I couldn't predict that what we're doing now is what we're up to. As you know, as I mentioned, this literally started as a blog post on my blog. And so to think that it's evolved into this is really funny, but it all started with just taking the first step. So I always tell people, it's like, you know what, you can sit around and analyze things until you're blue in the face, but you're not going to know anything until you have some legitimate feedback and real insight from actually taking a step, because you have to take an action to see what the result is going to be.
I agree. Now let's talk about this real quickly. And what about monetize? So somebody says, okay, I want to do this, but I need to feed my family. What about monetizing and how has that worked for you all?
Okay, so monetizing is a very sort of, it's a complex subject because it's something I've struggled with. I'll be honest, it's not my forte. I will say this, I've been lucky in that the situations I've been in have allowed me to do a lot of unusual things. I mean, I'm single, so I don't have a lot of people depending on me. I live at home, which is nice because it allows me to take some chances that other people can't take. But one of the things I'll say is something that Diana Valentine shared with me, and this is something that a lot of people should think about, is treating your day job as your angel investor in your business. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant because you want to get to this point where you have money set aside so that you can take some chances with your business, because the truth is that if you basically you leap without a net and you say, okay, now I got to figure out how to monetize, well, you're not going to necessarily be creative and brilliant when you're trying to figure out how to feed yourself.
Exactly.
That's the problem. So I think quitting your job is not necessarily the most brilliant way to go about this. I think that doing it gradually is smart. I mean, one of the things I realized is I wanted to make this my life's work. And from the moment I did get a day job when I got out of business school, I started basically saving money. I made sure that there was an account in which money went into, and that money was never touched. And so I think one of the temptations that people have is when they first start generating revenue, they treat it as a salary. And one of the things I always say is put your revenue back into your business until it snowballs. And that's a mistake I made, is that I wasn't putting the revenue I was generating initially. Like for example, I was getting $500 a month to do freelance work where my entire job was to update somebody's Facebook page. Literally took me 5 minutes a day. And I did put some of that money away, but really I should have constantly been investing that money back into the business and until it brought me more business. And that could have meant investing in coaches and whatever it is. I mean, the beautiful thing about having a day job is that you have resources that you can play with and you can use. Question is, what do you do with those resources? How do you spend your time? Do you come home and just watch TV? How do you spend your money on useless crap? And a lot of us unfortunately do, until you realize that, your priority has to change if you want everything else in your life to change. So that's something you want to think about. I mean, it's what our friend Dan Andrews calls a runway. He's like, every entrepreneur needs to give themselves a runway, and a lot of people don't. No runway, your plane is going to crash. That's all there is to it. Whereas if you have a runway, you can kind of say, okay, you know what? I'm 6 months out. I've got 6 months really to be smart about this, and 6 months in which I can really work it because I've got money saved up. And so you're not stressed out about, okay, I got to make money today, because if you make decisions from a place of desperation, Well, now your entire business is built on this desperation model, which is dangerous because then you do work that you're basically violating the very reasons that you started doing this in the first place.
I totally agree. I get this a lot with people. They'll say, I want to, even if it's a product-based business, like wholesale furniture and decor, I want to do what you do. You make a lot of money. And I have to explain to them, I sold that business. But the thing is for the first 2 years, my business partner and I, we did not take a salary. The company was profitable after the first year, but every bit of that money went back into the business because it's a business. So we didn't look at it as a lifestyle. It was a business. And to grow that business to the empire that we wanted, you have to reinvest. Reinvest money and reinvest in education and learning. So much has to be reinvested.
Well, like I said, there's a lot of people who wouldn't make the choices I make. Some people are like, oh, I don't want to move home. It's embarrassing. I was like, well, fine. I'm like, this isn't ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but guess what? It's like, that's $700 a month that I don't have to worry about.
Absolutely.
I live in Southern California. If I lived in LA, it might even be more than that. And so that allows flexibility that you wouldn't necessarily get. And so you kind of think about what sacrifices you are willing to make. What are you willing to give up to get what you want in the long run?
Absolutely. I think that's the best point is, a lot of people like, you hear this a lot with kids when they're growing up, teenagers. Well, I want the best car and I want a house like my mom and dad. Well, they don't realize that it took their parents 30 years to get there. You can't have all that in one day. Sacrifice today for great things tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. I look at what my parents have built, and they're immigrants. They came here with nothing, and I remember thinking as a kid, I was like, oh, I want to do better than that. Now I look at them and I was like, if I get to where they're at, I've done well. I look at what my dad has accomplished over the course of his life, and I always say, if I had the impact that he has and has accomplished what he has in his life, I would be very fulfilled and happy because I think he's done amazing things with his life.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's more than, like you said, it's a lifestyle. You surf a lot. You have the flexibility and freedom of having a business that you love, doing what you love, being passionate about that, and also getting to have some flexibility in your schedule to surf.
It's interesting because you kind of make choices from that place after a certain point of, okay, does this satisfy my values? Or it's what I call sort of making really important decisions based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs or your self-actualization needs. And most of us don't do that in general. What we do is we basically make our decisions from the lowest place on that pyramid, which is our needs for survival, safety, and security. And that's fine for like basic necessities. The problem is that if you start making really, really important decisions from that place, it's sort of dangerous because then you set yourself up for a very unfulfilling life.
I agree. I think this has been a fantastic interview and chat with you. I don't like to call it an interview. I like to call it a chat. But what I like most is that you continuously go back to saying that you analyze your business and listen to your followers and your fans. You don't look at how many fans you have. That's not the most important. I don't think you look at your Google Analytics all that often. You're analyzing what they're saying and making that change in your business. Do you think that has the biggest impact on what's going on?
Well, it's funny you asked that question because, David and I were talking the other day. He said, hey, I was like, hey, I'm curious, what are you working on? And so we put up this project management software. He said, look, he's like, you should tell me what you want to know about because he said, I know that you don't care about the data and the numbers, even though he does. And I said, you're right, I don't. What I care about is what people are doing and what people are behaving like. I'm more interested in that aspect of things. But data and numbers kind of tie to that. And so I do think that makes a huge difference. I mean, as I'd mentioned earlier, a lot of what's been driving many of the changes that we've been going through have been listener conversations and conversations with people. I mean, and an opportunity to tell my story to people like you is also very eye-opening because it makes me kind of realize things that I may have been blind to before. So yeah, I would say that is very key. I mean, the more you listen to people, the better off you're going to be. I think that Cameron Herold has this great line in his book. He said, he's like, you have 2 ears and one mouth. And the funny thing is, I'm a horrible listener in general. Blogcast FM has taught me to be a much better listener, which is why I love being on the other side of the mic because I get to talk for a change.
That's terrific. Hey, listen, I know you're writing a book, a self-published book. So you want to tell us a little bit how that's going? We can link that up.
We can link it up. I will tell you, becoming the bane of my existence. I look at it like I hate this book. It's interesting. I never thought that would happen, and I've interviewed a lot of published authors, as you know, and they have told me about this. They said it's a painful process to try to write a book. And so an interview I did recently has kind of made me rethink how I want to do it. It may end up basically coming out as a manifesto instead of a book, mainly because it's funny. School of Life has become a hobby almost, whereas Blogcast FM is a business, and Blogcast FM is getting more and more of my attention. Whereas School of Life, it's kind of like, okay, once a week I'll write something inspirational. I'll share it with the people who supported me, and I love doing it. It's still a lot of fun, but for some reason it seems to be less and less of a priority in comparison to what it used to be. And I think that's just the nature of the fact that I'm living as an entrepreneur now. And for me, I think School of Life is a place that allows a lot of creative self-expression. And so that book has been interesting. I mean, there are components of it that I love, and so that's why I've been sort of rethinking the idea of doing it as a manifesto. One is because I've never done a manifesto for the School of Life, and I think that it may have more potential to reach a lot of people that way than it would as just a book. But the whole process of writing it has been very interesting.
Do you think that based on where you are today, and this is probably a hard question, but will you continue on with the School Life blog, or do you see that eventually kind of going away since you're going to?
I probably will continue with it, mainly because it's what, as I said, for David, how Look was labor of love. The School of Life really is a labor of love at this point, and it does give me credibility because it shows that I can grow an audience. It shows that I can create content. And it's another place that keeps allowing me to refine my writing chops. And, as we talked about, writing is probably not my greatest strength. I mean, I'm not a bad writer, but I'm a better interviewer than I am a writer. I think everybody knows that. So it's one of those things. I mean, and it's a nice testing ground for ideas that I hear about on Blogcast FM. I can say, okay, you know what, let me try that. It provides sort of a laboratory almost for experimentation. And it's a laboratory with a lot of subject matter to play with. It's not a laboratory that is a vacuum. So it's useful and it provides a lot of feedback.
It's a great blog as well. So we'll link that up. If someone wanted to touch base with you, where's the best place to reach you?
Well, there's a couple of places. You can either email me at srinirao@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at School of Life. And if you go to blogcastfm.com, you can learn a lot about what I do and what I'm up to.
Awesome. Srini, this has been terrific. I appreciate you taking the time, and I think the people are going to get a lot of information from this, and you've been terrific. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.